Hi everyone. Today we are going to talk about self-sterility or self-incompatibility. So, self-sterility or self-incompatibility, it is one of the most important outbreeding devices, or you can say it is an adaptation that ensures cross pollination, or you can say outbreeding. Okay. Self-sterility or self-incompatibility, it is most widespread and most effective natural way to ensure outbreeding. Most widespread means it is present in a large number of plant species. Alright. Now you can define self-sterility. There are two ways of defining self-sterility or self-incompatibility. The first one is the inability of a plant producing functional male and female gametes so as to set seeds when self-pollinated. If you are having a plant and that plant is not capable of producing seeds when self-pollinated, अगर आपके पास एक plant है and that plant fails to produce seeds when self-pollinated, that type of plant can be known as self-incompatible plant. याद रखना. Self-incompatible plants are those plants which fail to produce seeds when they are self-pollinated. The next definition, the next alternative of defining the self-incompatibility is the pollen grains of the flower are incapable of germination or growth over the stigma of the genetically same flower. Here you can understand it more clearly. We are having three flowers. These are the stamens. This is the stigma, flower A. Then we have second flower. This is stigma. These are the anthers, flower B. Then we have third flower. This is stigma. These are the stamens. Okay. This is flower C. These two flowers are present on the same plant, so the genetic constitution of flower B and flower C, that will be obviously same. But this flower C, it is present on another plant. Okay, it is present on a separate plant. So obviously the genetic constitution of this C, it may be different. Okay, the genetic constitution of flower C, it may be different because it is present on a different plant. अब एक मामला ये है, the pollen grains that are produced in this anther, if they land on its own stigma, because the stigma has the same genetic constitution as that of the pollen grain, this pollen grain will fail to germinate. यहाँ तो germination हो जाएगी, लेकिन the germination of pollen tube will be halted. याद रखना. Or in simple terms, you can say that this landing of the pollen grain on its own stigma, it will not lead to the formation of seeds. Likewise, the pollen grains which are produced in the anther of this flower, if they land on the stigma of this flower, flower A, but this flower A, remember, it is present on the same plant. So obviously, the genetic constitution of the flower, the genetic constitution of this pistil, it will be same as that of the pollen grain. And likewise, this pollen grain will not be able to cause pollination. It will not be able to produce the male gametes. Okay. However, if this pollen grain, it lands on the stigma of this flower, flower C, which is present on a different plant having different genetic constitution, it will be able to germinate. It germinates and form the pollen tubes, and it will form the pollen tube, and ultimately the male gametes will be formed, and hence seeds will be formed. याद रखना. अगर ये pollen grain है, it will land on the stigma of this flower C, present on a different plant having different genetic constitution. It will germinate, it will form the pollen tube, it will form the male gametes, and ultimately fertilization will take place, and the seeds and fruits will be formed. Now the mechanism of self-incompatibility. Self-incompatibility is genetically controlled phenomenon. It is a genetically controlled phenomenon. And the genetic control of self-incompatibility was first of all proposed by Mangelsdorf in the year 1925. He called this hypothesis as opposition S allele hypothesis. He proposed a hypothesis which is known as opposition S allele hypothesis, and this opposition S allele hypothesis, it has been used to explain self-incompatibility responses in plants. According to this hypothesis, incompatibility reaction in plants is controlled by a gene which is known as S gene, and this S gene has many alleles. It has many alternative forms including S1, S2, S3, S4, etc. Okay. Now this theory, this hypothesis, it believes that the pollen grains that possess the S allele common to any of the two S alleles present in the cells of the pistil will not be functional on that particular pistil. याद रखना, अगर पोलन ग्रेन में S allele वो होगा जो S allele pistil में भी है, that pollen grain will not be able to germinate on that pistil. याद रखना. It will get more clear on the next slide. So self-incompatibility, it is of two types. You can also understand this the meaning of this line on the next slide. Okay, it is of two types: gametophytic self-incompatibility and sporophytic self-incompatibility. Now the first one, gametophytic self-incompatibility. In this type of incompatibility, the outcome of incompatibility reaction between the pollen tube, or you can say pollen grain, and the style, it is determined by the genotype of the pollen or male gametophyte. The incompatibility reaction, the incompatibility response in gametophytic self-incompatibility, it is determined by the genotype of the pollen grain or male gametophyte. याद रखना. Here you can see you have two pollen grains having genotype S1, S2. You have the genotype of the stellar tissue, because it is diploid tissue, it is having genotype S1, S2. याद रखना. If the genotype of the pollen, it resembles the genotype of any of the two alleles present in the stellar tissue, that pollen grain will not be able to germinate. Like here you can see S1 resembles S1, it will not be able to germinate, and this S2 resembles S2, it will not be able to germinate. Simple. Now the next scenario is you have S1, S2 pollen grains, but the genotype of the stellar tissue is S1, S3. This S1, it resembles the genotype, it resembles the allele S1, it will not be able to germinate, but this S2, it does not resemble any of the two alleles. Okay, it has here S3, it doesn't resemble any of the S alleles, and obviously it will be able to germinate, and it germinates and causes fertilization and seed set occurs. The third scenario is you have S1, S2 and S3, S4. Neither of the two pollen grains, they do not resemble any of the alleles which are present in the stellar tissue. यहाँ पे आपका है S3, यहाँ पे S4 है. S1 will be able to germinate, and S2 also will be able to germinate. Okay. So in gametophytic self-incompatibility, the incompatibility reaction is determined by the genotype of the pollen grain or male gametophyte. There are some other important features of GSI. S locus products, that means the genes, the products of the S gene which determine the incompatibility, they are produced, they are synthesized after completion of meiosis. याद रखना. The S locus products are synthesized after completion of meiosis, and the growth of the pollen tube, it gets arrested in the style. Pollen tube germination हो जाती है, pollen tube थोड़ा grow हो जाता है, but it is not able to grow further. It is not able to grow beyond this point. याद रखना. The growth of pollen tube gets arrested in the style. Now you can remember the names of some families that show GSI. You have Solanaceae, Sucrofloraceae, Poaceae, Fabaceae, Campanulaceae, Onagraceae, Papaveraceae, and Rosaceae. Now what is sporophytic self-incompatibility? In this type of incompatibility, the incompatibility reaction or incompatibility response is determined by the genotype of the plant that contributes the pollen grains. याद रखना. The incompatibility reaction is determined by the genotype of the plant that contributes the pollen grains instead of the pollen grain itself. याद रखना. Here you can see you have the two pollen grains S1, S2, having the alleles S1, S2. The stellar tissue is having the genotype S1, S2. None of these pollen grains will be able to germinate. Okay, understood? The second one is S1, S2, and here you have S1, S3. Stellar tissue का genotype है S1, S3. But here you should have expected that S2 should have germinated. But याद रखना, since incompatibility reaction is determined by the genotype of the pollen producing parent, pollen producing parent का genotype S1, S2 होगा. याद रखना, अगर pollen producing parent का genotype S1, S2 है और stellar tissue का है S1, S3, अगर कोई भी मैच हो रहा है, ये S1 के साथ मैच हो रहा है, ठीक है, तो ये दोनों जर्मिनेट नहीं हो जाएंगे. अगर किसी भी पोलन का जो जीनोटाइप है, it is indirectly the genotype of the pollen producing parent. Okay, if the pollen producing parent has any allele which resembles the allele of the stellar tissue, none of the pollen grains will be able to germinate. अगर pollen producing parent का कोई भी एलील मैच करता हो स्टेलर टिश्यू के एलील के साथ, याद रखना, none of the pollen grains will be able to germinate. This is the difference between GSI and sporophytic self-incompatibility. Okay. Now another important feature of sporophytic self-incompatibility is, we will discuss the final scenario here. Here you have, in the third scenario, you have S1 and S2. In the stellar tissue you have S3 and S4, and both of these pollen grains they will be able to germinate and and lead to the formation of gametes, ultimately causing fertilization and fruit set and formation of seeds. Here you can see it is S1, S2. That means pollen producing plant का genotype है S1, S2, and stellar tissue का है S3, S4. कोई भी एलील मैच नहीं कर रहा है. Okay, none of the alleles of the pollen producing parent resembles the alleles of the stellar tissue, and that is why both the pollen grains will be able to germinate and cause fertilization. The S locus products, they are synthesized before completion of meiosis. जो S locus products है, जो S gene के products है, in case of sporophytic self-incompatibility, they are synthesized before completion of meiosis. Meiosis से पहले ही बन जाते हैं. याद रखना. This is very much important. The S locus products, they are synthesized before completion of meiosis. And the growth of the pollen tube, it gets arrested on the surface of stigma. Here you can see in sporophytic self-incompatibility, the growth of the pollen tube, it gets arrested. The pollen tube rather it does not germinate. Okay, it is not able to germinate. यहाँ पे arrest हो जाता था यहाँ पे stellar tissue में, लेकिन यहाँ पे sporophytic self-incompatibility में the pollen grain is not able to germinate on the stigma. याद रखना. This is very much important. The growth of the pollen tube, it gets arrested at the surface of stigma in case of sporophytic self-incompatibility. Now the examples of the plant families that show sporophytic self-incompatibility, there are many such families, like we have Brassicaceae, Pulmonaceae, Caryophyllaceae, Betulaceae, Asteraceae, and Convolvulaceae. Okay, these are some important families showing sporophytic self-incompatibility. So in nutshell, you can say that gametophytic self-incompatibility is that type of incompatibility in which the incompatibility response is determined by the genotype of the pollen grain or male gametophyte. And sporophytic self-incompatibility is that type of incompatibility in which the incompatibility response is determined by the genotype of the plant that contributes the pollen grain instead of the pollen grain itself. याद रखना, this is very much important. So this is all about self-incompatibility. I hope you all understand this. See you soon with a new lesson. Till then, take care.